political purposes, and that's why the church and the state have always worked hand in hand on this stuff, and they definitely did in this genocide. So for me, it's part of this bigger movement to reclaim ourselves, to reclaim our sovereignty and our power in a society that is very much needing us to be atomized and feeling dependent and powerless. And so when we're looking at child abuse anywhere in the world and the child trafficking we're documenting and all that, it's really a story about all of us, because it's naming what happened to you. I know in healing circles, the first step anyone has to go through is to say, this did happen to me, and own it and name what happened. And that's always the first hurdle to get over with people, accepting the fact that this happened to us. So I think I'll just stop there by saying that because of that, this is connected to so many other issues we're involved in. And I find that working with people, either native or non-native, in Canada about this, the people who are best able to look at it are those who have grappled personally with their own story. Like, I remember when I first started listening to native people on the coast, I said, well, tell me about yourself. And this one native chief, Nelson Keatla, said, the whites have always said that to us. We want to hear about you. That's how they stole our land. That's how they stole our culture and our language and everything. No, we want to hear from you white people. We want to know your story now. We want to know, well, how is it that you were able to come here and do this to us? So, what is it in your culture that allowed that to happen? So for me, it's very much that now, like looking at the roots of this in Europe, and how we did it to ourselves here first. My family had to leave Ireland. My great-grandfather's whole family died of typhus and starvation on the ship over to Canada. Right? And standing in Cork on the harbour they left from last year, it struck me like right in the chest. Bam! This genocide happened to our family too, right? And it was done by the same empire, using the same methods. And so that's why I think it's something that we can all be involved in. It isn't just kind of a charity mission for those poor Indians. It's really something that's our story. And I think I'll end it on that and ask for your own thoughts and comments.
Thanks.
Or questions or anything you want to ask about?
Well, I mean, just to take up that last point you've made, I mean, my ancestry is Irish and Welsh, basically. We're basically very close to Wales here. There's been a history of suppression of what I call the Celtic fringes in Britain for many years, the culture. You can talk about the Highland clearances, you can talk about the things that happened in Ireland with the absentee landlords and all of that, which meant that, millions of people actually came to Liverpool or went to North America mostly. But it was all about suppressing the culture, the dignity, the worth of people. And you're absolutely right in my opinion. It's actually about how one culture dominates and controls or tries to control economically, culturally, in every way. And then, of course, what's left are broken people often, because they've had everything taken away from them. So, yeah, I'd wholeheartedly agree with you and say that this is about what happens worldwide, I think, all the time, and it's going on now. It's going on now.
I'd ask, why Indigenous people? Why is it like a kind of whites against black type of reason that they do that thing, or is it just? I mean, what would you think the main reason is?
Well, I think it's about economy and it's about religion and how the two are related. Primarily, I mean, there's other causes too. But for example, we came out of a culture where there were laws passed centuries ago by the Vatican that said, and they're actually rooted in an older Roman tradition, where before the Romans invaded an area, and like the Vatican is the descendant of the Roman Empire. It's the empire with they even adopt all. You probably know all this. The symbols and the language and everything is straight out of the Roman Empire. So it's not so much Christian as a symbiosis between the church and the empire. And what they said, the Romans originally, before they invaded an area, their lawyers nullified the rights of the people in the targeted area. And that's where we get the expression null and void, because nullius in Latin means to negate or to wipe clean something. So before they would invade an area, they said those people don't exist anymore. Therefore, the Romans could take their land legally. The Pope did the same thing in 2 papal bulls passed in the 1400s. There was one called Romanus Pontifex in 1455, and what it said, Pope Nicholas said, non-Christian people do not have the right to the land because they're not Christian, and it is the obligation and duty of every Christian king to take their land and make them perpetual slaves or kill them. I mean, it said that in black and white in the papal bull. Then the Intercaterra Bull in 1493, Pope Alexander said, he took a map and he drew a line down the middle of it, and everything to the left in the Western Hemisphere was Spain's, and everything in Africa and Asia was Portugal's, which included Brazil. And literally they said, go for it, just take the world. And that religious legitimation allowed colonialism all over the world. So indigenous people here in Europe suffered under the same thing. That's what the witch hunting was all about, the witch burning, the forcing traditional people out of their way of life, and that gave rise to industrial capitalism. You had to get people off the land as a landless workforce into the factories here and in Manchester and Birmingham and everywhere to create massive wealth for this new merchant class, right? Now, in the way they used, the methods they used were identical in that, whether it's here in England or over in the New World. They had industrial schools where they criminalized the poor. They said people are poor because they're morally defective. So we have to teach them properly. So they take children of the poor and put them in these industrial workshops where they were sweated labor. They used that as the model for the Indian residential schools, along with the Jesuit plan for how you go in and subvert an indigenous culture, and you convert a few chiefs to Catholicism and then wipe out the indigenous chiefs. And that's exactly what they did in Canada and the US and all over Latin America now. So those two together created the Indian boarding schools, but it was a replication of what had started here centuries ago. They did the same in the Highland clearances. They brought in mission schools where you weren't allowed to speak Gaelic or wear the kilt and any of that, right? So it was the same pattern. And I think also just the final part of it is indigenous people have a different way of looking at the world. It's not clock oriented, it's not written. It's much more in harmony with the natural order. They have a very common worldview of not being separate from nature, but everything being God, if you like, right? And that's not a worldview that's conducive to the modern economic political system. So that's why indigenous people keep getting destroyed and why their languages are disappearing rapidly, because it's like this big machine and it's never being turned off. I mean, the window dressing on the machine changes and the verbiage, the language changes, but this machine keeps eating up the planet and the indigenous people, because they are one with the planet, really. And it's also because we carry this twisted philosophy coming out of original sin that says there's something suspect about innocence, whether it's in a child or in nature. And I find this talking still today to those members of my family that are still fairly Orthodox Christian. They can't get away from the idea that, well, people have got to be improved, the world's got to be improved, it's not good the way it is, and that's coming out of that philosophy. I don't say all Christians are like that, but kind of at the root of this indoctrination we've all received is that distrust of ourselves. And I think all of that thrown in the mix, that's why it keeps happening. And so it's part of this bigger thing we got to look at. Right.
Definitely. And I've actually spotted something, the things you said have actually been illustrated perfectly well by my experience, the hour I spent walking around this area of the city of Liverpool before I met up with you. The first is you were mentioning time, the structures of time. If you walk down the streets in this town, you find that all the clocks are wrong or they're not working. I had to switch my mobile phone on to find out what the time was, and it was Well, I was going to say this Liverpool is essentially it's like an Irish city. Its cultural basis is Irish in England, and what else do we have here based on what you've just been saying? Across the road from me, it's called the George Hall, I think. Yeah. We have a neoclassical. It's a monstrosity across the road. This neoclassical pile of. Which would look perfectly familiar to someone who lived in Rome under the Caesars. They recognise that architecture immediately, and it's right there in front of us. What you call the thread, the fact that there's this sort of like thread running through history of the empire, the fact that the names change, but the methods don't. And here we see they're telling us, look guys, we're still in business, we didn't go away. And there we are, we're still dominating you to this very day.
Well, that's why I was so, when I heard about the, in Birkenhead the other day, when everyone showed up in the court and said, you know, we don't recognize that system of law anymore, we believe in common law. And that's, in terms of dealing with this whole thing, there's a really important book that's being written by Jeffrey Robinson called The Case of the Pope. And he's a human rights lawyer in London. And he takes on all the arguments the Vatican uses to why the Pope can't be tried for these crimes. And he shows it's all fallacy about the claim that there's state and all of that. And he says there's a strong basis to prosecute him and anybody who's been involved in hiding child abuse within the church. But the political will isn't there because the governments themselves have colluded in these crimes for a long time in the church. So it's like when I was in New York talking to some people at the UN, and we were talking about how to start a process of investigating these crimes in the Indian boarding schools. And he said, well, name a country in Europe that didn't commit the same genocide. I mean, who of them really wants to open this? Because their own stuff is going to come out, okay? So you picked a really difficult issue here because although what was interesting was a few years ago, somebody in Belgium was being grilled at the UN for what happened in the Congo and Rwanda, right? And he said the Canadian diplomat was accusing him of genocide, and he picked up a copy of my research, the Belgian guy, and held it up and said, well, thousands of children died in your Indian boarding schools. Who are you to preach to us, right? So you can lever some of these situations, but I think the important thing to realize is that the simple fact is that the institutions that did these crimes are still in power. And so naturally you're going to get a whitewash. Naturally it's going to be covered up and there's going to be an attempt to discourage people like, you know, that happens all the time. But at the same time it's being exposed. They can't hide it anymore. And that's an amazingly powerful weapon just to have that truth out there.
There's a couple of things
Yeah.
just on my mind. I mean, just first of all, just to look back, I mean, you've obviously made a study of divinity and church history from your background and so on. Is it the case, am I right in thinking that the doctrine of original sin, which you referred to, was something that was basically formulated in the 4th century? It wasn't actually part of the original teachings of Christ or anything like that. And it was it Augustine or?
It's from the church, it's not from the Christian tradition before that, right? And that's the thing to realize, like with the doctrine of the Trinity, which is not in the Bible anywhere, the Virgin Mary, that in the Bible, the first edition, if you like, the Vulgate Bible in Latin, was translated from the Hebrew and the Greek. In the translation, the word for young girl was translated as virgin. But the doctrine of the Virgin was not adopted till during the time of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, just like clerical celibacy. You know, that one about the Pope is infallible, that didn't come out till 1870. And they didn't even have a majority of cardinals voting for the doctrine, so it's like, these are all political moves by the church. They're not faith statements, they're and that's what people in the church don't even understand about their own history. They go, so.
It's really a massive issue. I have listened to the 2 clips that have been sent to me, and it really overwhelmed me in a way because there are so many levels to this, and it joins with so many issues. And the first thing that just comes to my mind is the actual issue of child abuse, because it seems to me that it's not even accepted that it exists generally, especially in sexual child abuse. We do have certain, people dealing with these things, but it's all kind of always swept under the carpet as soon as it can be. That's one thing. Another thing is it's linked with the issue of